was up here, I was wearing a really thick wool sweater, and Alan told me I looked like autumn embodied. So I decided to try to be as summer forward as I could today. So I hope it's working out. In the summer of 1974, I was a happy, just recently completed kindergarten 6-year-old, and I was informed that we were moving to Singapore. Now, Singapore is far away on the other side of the world today. It was even farther away then. And I didn't know what to do with myself. I was going to leave my entire life behind. My wonderful kindergarten teacher in Oakland, Mrs. Lockett, sat me down outside the school one day and said, "You're going on a journey. You will come back. Home will still be here." And so early August of 1974 found me on a plane leaving California, the US coast, moving away from my home in Pittsburgh towards Singapore. I had been allowed to bring 2 things with me on the plane to remind me of home. The first one, for reasons I'm still working through in therapy, is a Rosemary Clooney album. I still haven't figured that out. And the second one was, well, you should know that I've been, since almost birth, a Star Trek fan. My sister put me down in front of the television at her dorm at McAllister College when I was 18 months old, and I had been hooked ever since. So by the time I was 6, I was so into the OG Star Trek. And one of my father's colleagues at the University of Pittsburgh had a teenage son. I still remember his name. I haven't seen him in 50 years. His name was Nicholas Parslow, and he was a woodworker. And somehow, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the communicator in Star Trek. I'll describe it briefly. It's this little cigarette pack-sized communications device, long before there were cell phones, that you flip up, and there's a little metal screen, and under it are some buttons and a little speaker, and you ask to be beamed aboard the USS Enterprise for journeys into space. And I love this thing. I was obsessed with this thing. And so Nicholas Parslow went into his wood shop somewhere in Squirrel Hill, and he built one for me out of wood and little colored buttons and an improvised wire screen that flipped down long before the flip phone. So these were my connections to home. So I'm sitting on this plane contemplating my lot, moving to Singapore, and I actually remember the exact date. It was August 8th, 1974, because the pilot came on that day and said, "President Nixon has just resigned." And the whole plane was discussing this, and there was an energy aboard the plane. I remember only this energy. So I, at one point, decided to go back to the plane's lavatory, and I needed a little bit of 6-year-old alone time. It was really thrilling to be able to do that on a plane where there were 200, this was a 747, an early 747, and there were like 200 and some people on this plane, and I had this tiny little room to myself. So I sat there for a while. I thought about things. I played with my communicator. I thought of Rosemary Clooney, probably. I went back to my seat, and I started to try to take a nap. My parents had given me the window seat. And after a few minutes, we note that something is happening, and it wasn't about President Nixon, ex-President Nixon. It was people were going back. They were going back toward the lavatories in the back of the plane. They were going back toward, in particular, the lavatory on the side that I had just been in, and they were clustered around there, and there was some serious talking going on. And there were flight attendants, we called them stewardesses then, but flight attendants. There was a man in plain clothes, I didn't really know who he was, and they were talking about things. And it suddenly dawned on me that I had left my little improvised communicator in the bathroom. Now, again, reminder, this was 1974, and although a lot of people knew about Star Trek, a lot of people didn't. And a lot of people didn't necessarily know what a small cigarette pack-sized piece of wood with some improvised buttons and a little thing that might or might not be a speaker and some wire screen over it, sitting in a lavatory of a 747 bound for Singapore might actually be. So, really looking out the window. And I tell my mother this timidly, and my mother, being my mother, an exceedingly moral and ethical individual, said, "You have to go tell them. They don't know what this is." And so I say, "Can't you tell them?" "No, you have to do it. This is, you created the situation, you'll address the situation." Now, in fairness, she did follow me about 6 feet behind, but I went back 1 cabin, went back 2 cabins to the back of the plane, went to this phalanx, and I don't think I've ever said that word out loud, but it's a great word, of people who looked very, very serious. And I said, excuse me, I'm not sure what you're looking for, but I left something in that bathroom. Looking down at me, looking up at them. And they said, can you describe it? A man stepped forward. And I said, well, it's an improvised communicator. And I know that at age 6, you think I wasn't saying improvised. I was a really annoying, heavy vocabulary little kid. My parents were linguistics professors, so I did, in fact, say improvised. And they brought it out somewhat gingerly. I mean, this was well before 9/11. I had gotten through security with this thing somehow. I don't remember how. So they were holding it. I identified this thing as my own. I got a lot of glares from a lot of people, and not just the people there, but all the people who were turning around and who were flying somewhere in Asia and were not happy about this potential disruption. And they gave it back to me. I still can't believe they gave it back to me. And I took my little improvised Star Trek communicator and I went back to my seat and I tried to make myself as small as possible for the rest of the flight. Things turned out okay. We got on a stopping point in Bangkok, and for some reason, in Bangkok, I put that little improvised communicator in a drawer, and when we came back from the day's events, it was gone. So I never saw it again. I loved that thing, but I never saw it again. But we spent the year in Singapore, and I know a year doesn't sound like a big thing, but for a 6-year-old, it's 1/6 of your life, and it seems interminable. It was a great time. It started me on a long road of internationalism and of engaging with other culture, and I'm very, very, very glad about that. And I came home. Mrs. Laquette was right. Home was still there. We had moved out, but we hadn't moved on, and it was still waiting for us. And I grew up hoping that things like that, like a communicator, like a ship traveling the stars, would actually happen. And lo and behold, in the 1990s, Motorola came up with the flip phone. I got one of the first ones. I insisted that it was for work. Maybe some. And I kept buying flip phones, and then finally the iPhone came out. And I'll tell you something. I was that little kid holding the communicator on the plane, thinking that if I was 35,000 feet closer to space, that someone might hear me on the little communicator and might beam me aboard somewhere, and I might get to go explore. And so now, all of these years later, we have this iPhone, and it can do that. And it can't beam me into space, but it can do almost everything else. All of the things that the gadgets in Star Trek could do, I never dreamed that this was possible. And once I left this, briefly, in an airplane bathroom, and nobody was the slightest bit perturbed. So I guess carrying this with me is kind of enough, but we don't need teenagers with woodworking shops anymore to play with our dreams. And so you can order on Amazon whatever you want these days. And so I will take the iPhone. I love the iPhone. I want the new model of the iPhone. It's too expensive, but I want it anyway. But I will tell you that there's something else that I make sure of. There was a character on the original Star Trek that probably most of you know called Mr. Spock, and one of the things he would say is that there are always possibilities. And I will tell you this. There are always possibilities.
Brad, everybody. I feel like it was like an Apple product launch speech.